You're listening to Southeast Radio's Business Matters with Karl Fitzpatrick in association with Wexford Insurances. Challenge us at Wexford Insurances 0818 31 30 30.
I'm joined now by Tony Gallacher from AMG eSolutions. I know, Tony, that you moved over from the UK 2 years ago and set up the company. Maybe start by telling me a little bit about your own background before we get into talking about the entire area of cloud computing.
You're right, I've been over here for 2 years. I've worked for the last 40 years, strangely enough, almost, for large corporates, for Unilever, for ICI, for Henkel, 25 years of which were in sales and sales management and business management. And the latter 15 years were in IT management, specifically areas of e-business.
Okay, and what prompted the move to Ireland 2 years ago?
Well, we have family here in Wexford. Just before we moved over, the Henkel organisation decided that their senior executives all need to be placed in their Dusseldorf head office. With 6,000 people working a head office, it's not an ideal environment, and it was a simple decision, really. Do I actually move over to a nice sunny southeast of Wexford or embroiled in the centre of Dusseldorf? And it was a simple decision, which is why I'm here.
When you arrived here in Wexford, you set up your IT and business consultancy, AMG eSolutions. Probably not the greatest time in the world to set that up here. How have you found business and growing the business over the past 2 years?
I've actually found it quite easy in some respects, driven mainly by the networking that is around. Specifically, when I first came over, I joined the Wexford Chamber. At the same time, the B2B networking event was starting up, and that was pivotal from my perspective in terms of getting my business established and business growth. Explain
to me how you harnessed that networking to develop the business.
Well, predominantly it's actually getting out to people and explaining what I do, what value I can deliver to these businesses, and also get an understanding of the types of businesses that are around Wexford. That helped me to tailor my approach to those businesses in terms of what I could actually bring to the table, what value they would get out of it. So from that perspective, it was a joint learning experience. But with each of the businesses I had a connection with, it either led to business or a referral onto someone else who could give me some business. So my clients generally came through some form of connection through the networking events.
That's a great reflection on, I suppose, both Wexford Chamber and the overall concept of networking here in County Wexford. Tony, the reason I asked you to come into the studio this morning to join me was to speak about the area of cloud computing. The term cloud computing seems to be on everyone's lips these days. What exactly does it mean?
Well, you're right, it's on everybody's lips, and I think partly due to the fact that it's actually being promoted an awful lot from government down. I mean, for example, it's actually as part of a proposal in the jobs sort of creation for 2012. There is a big move towards looking at research into cloud computing. Unfortunately, what that tends to do is to create another set of jargon that goes out to everybody, which creates its own mystique. It's almost what I used to call the black arts of IT at one point. And actually, sort of the more jargon you create, the more secure you are in an IT environment. Unfortunately, for a small business, you need to get rid of all that mystique. You've got to find a means by which you can actually say to someone, this is exactly what it is. Now, what I'd like to do, if I can, Karl, is just read you an article which I actually think illustrates the effect of misunderstanding of the term cloud computing. It's actually a Connemara councillor who said this. So I'll just read this out because actually it's better to read it rather than just remember it.
Please do.
A local councillor in Connemara told the infrastructure committee meeting this week that his native Connemara would be ideal for cloud computing because it has heavy cloud cover for 9 months of the year. The independent councillor said that the government should be doing more to harness clean industries for the Connemara area, and he named wind energy and cloud computing as two obvious examples. Connemara in particular could become a centre of excellence for wind energy harnessing as it is open to the Atlantic. Also, in terms of cloud computing, we have dense thick fog for 9 months of the year because of the mountain heights and the ability to harness these things. It could become a major employer in this region. Now, at this point in time, there was actually a bit of an infraction in the council chamber, as you can understand, and one of his colleagues, I shall leave out the expletives, but actually sort of called him something which would normally not be sort of seen in polite society. But the most important thing for me was that when he was challenged, he actually turned around and his argument was based on, tell me why large companies are opening server farms in cold, wet countries then. That was his basis of an argument. Very humorous, very funny, but the message is actually clear. Because someone misunderstood it, he was actually hanging his hat on the idea that this is what we could do in this area. Now, businesses can do the same by getting confused about what exactly is cloud computing. In essence, really, cloud computing it's a change in the way you do your business. Fundamentally, it's taking the information and data that you would normally have on your own premises and putting it somewhere else, and you then plug into it.
How will cloud computing change business in that regard?
I think the biggest change that people are going to find is in three areas. They'll see a change in costs. They'll see a change in their ability to scale their business. And they'll see a change in their ability to manage mobile workforces and mobile people.
Explain those to me in greater detail. Firstly, let's say on the cost base. Where do the cost savings come into this?
The cost savings actually come in three ways. The first way is if you have hardware. A lot of businesses these days will have invested in a server. If they're not yet invested in a server, they might be doing it. Typical sort of server costs in terms of putting a server in place, putting the hardware in place, the software that needs to run it, all the licenses that you'll be doing, can set a business back up to €10,000 just to get their file server in place. And that doesn't include maintaining the server and all of the ancillaries that you need to go with it. So that's one area that you can save. By taking that away and moving it into a cloud environment, you can cut those costs down by 80%, which is an enormous sum.
And from a scalability perspective, Tony, where's the change coming there?
Well, when I mean scalability, it's often down to the way that businesses have to bring new people in, changing of people. Scalability is about sort of the way you can cut costs by not having to bring in new software for every person who comes in, new hardware for everybody comes in that's going to run that software, and also setting them up with the same infrastructure, the same connection to the files. That's actually quite a cost. If you think about an induction program for someone coming into a new business, apart from equipping them, you then have to go through the process of, this is where we put this file, this is our procedures that we have in place to manage this information. It makes that quicker and, in fact, more productive from that perspective. And the third area, I think, is an interesting one, because businesses these days are becoming more mobile in the sense that more and more of their staff are needing to go outside to do something. It might be to visit a client or to do something else that is not on site. And sometimes you need them to work outside of office hours, and you don't want to have to bring them in to site. That relies on you actually having to have some means of connecting to the files that might be on your server, or you've got to place secondary versions of them on someone's laptop, and they're traveling around. By putting something into the cloud, or data's in the cloud, it doesn't matter where anybody is. It doesn't even matter what device they're working on. You're not restricted to working from a laptop or a desktop. You can access these things via a tablet device or even smartphones if you wish. By taking that information to one single place, it has a dramatic impact on the productivity of your workers, and more importantly, on the costs of actually managing and touching those data files.
From what you're saying, Tony, there certainly seems to be significant benefits for larger businesses. But how does that, I suppose, adopt itself to SME type businesses? As 90% of businesses across County Wexford have less than 10 staff, will they gain the same benefits from it?
Funny enough, in many respects, the gain for a small business can be greater in percentage terms than the gain for a large business. If, for example, you are working with a single server, that is an immediate effect, an immediate benefit that you can actually gain. But for the majority of people, it's the fact that, the costs that you save in terms of software licensing, the costs that you actually save in terms of getting your staff more productive. So if you have a small team, that team is able to collaborate better and quicker. So in real terms, a small business, an SME, can actually get greater advantages, greater benefits, because they'll see it quicker, they'll see the return quicker, and to be perfectly honest, they'll see the workforce actually improve quicker.
Well, on that basis, with the advantages that you've outlined, why are more and more businesses not after adopting cloud computing technology to date?
I think there are two answers to that. One is information. Many people just don't understand what cloud computing is. There's a lot of confusion, there's a lot of mystique, and there's a lot of terminology that actually turns people off from the idea of what it could do, because IT basically frightens people. They see it as a cost, they see of change as a cost. So bringing this change in is cost rather than cost reduction to them. But the second point is the key enabler for cloud computing, and that is your broadband connectivity. Without good broadband connectivity, it will have an impact on your ability to be able to move things into the cloud. And it's more about how much information you're going to pass back and forward. But that's changing it slowly in Wexford. So there are providers of good connectivity within the area that will enable businesses to actually adopt a cloud strategy.
Are we there today?
I think we're partway there today. I think there are signs happening now that certainly businesses are looking at alternatives to the usual way of providing their broadband. We're not there yet. I think there's a way to go yet, and as more investment comes into the area in that broadband infrastructure, more and more people will feel capable of actually moving on to the next stage in their business process.
What do you think needs to happen with broadband for us to be in a position to be able to roll out cloud computing across the county?
It's interesting about broadband. For the majority of people, it's actually more about getting stability in their broadband connection. So certainly the bandwidth, and when most people talk about bandwidth, they talk in terms of megabits and what the sizing is, but they forget that there actually is an upstream and a downstream side of it. For the majority of times when people are using their broadband connections, it's for email and for browsing the web. Most of that is a downstream, and they forget that upstream is important. So as soon as you start to push files out on a cloud, you need a good upstream to downstream. So the majority of residential or small business packages will give you quite a good downstream, but very poor upstream. So it is changing, but it needs to be changed in the way that businesses understand what their requirements really are. And to be perfectly honest, there are providers within the Wexford area who are able to offer stable broadband connections, and it's also about latency as well, and how much you share that connection with someone else.
I know that from speaking to local business people, lots of them have concerns in relation to security on the cloud. What's your answer to that?
Well, it's good to see that people are actually worrying about the security of data, because it's a big issue for everybody these days. Lots is heard about large organisations who are being hacked into. The majority of times people are hacking into information and data because it has a value. And for most people, businesses, you would see that your data has a value, but does it have a real value to someone else? That said, the majority of the providers of cloud-based services do actually store the data in very secure data hubs. So they're sitting behind firewalls, they're sitting behind sort of a structure which is probably far more secure than most small businesses' servers are in-house. So actually they're probably likely to increase their security of data rather than decrease it.
So Tony, what you're saying is that you should do plenty of due diligence when choosing a cloud-based service provider. Most of us out there, that wouldn't be IT savvy, wouldn't know how to go looking at service providers from that perspective and how to carry out due diligence in relation to it. What tips would you provide business people with today that would allow them to choose a competent cloud-based service provider?
I think there are three important things you need to understand. The first thing is be absolutely sure what you want to do with the cloud. So that if it is that you actually need to put a server in there, then it helps you to understand who you're looking for. Someone who will provide you with the capability of hosting your own server. If it's to do with your own data, then be clear about what it is that you want to do. That's the first thing. Absolutely clear. What are my objectives? What do I want to get out of this? The second thing is to consider is the credibility of the people you're looking at. Lots and lots of web hosting companies at the moment are offering cloud services, but in reality what they're actually doing is offering a virtual server. So look for the credibility. How long they've been around? What is their data structure like? If they're working on a hub, where is that hub placed? And the third, I suppose, and most important thing of all of this is to make sure you understand the costs. In this instance, cheapest isn't always best, neither is most expensive best. It's looking at what is the cost related to what I actually want, because those three things will help you to understand, am I in a position to move towards getting value out of moving to cloud?
Apart from choosing a cloud-based service provider, what are the other risks associated with a business moving over to cloud?
I suppose change in any case makes a risk for most people. If you are moving your data from your own premises to somewhere else, then there's a risk of constant access. In other words, if your broadband goes down, your access to your data goes down. So you need to consider the relevance of what you're doing. If it's business critical, you need to make sure you've got some form of plan in place of how to connect to it if your broadband goes down temporarily. That's one risk. The other risk is, for majority of people, it's a business change. You're changing the way that you manage the information. And that means people. That means procedures and processes. If you don't actually understand that you have to change your business process, again, that can be a risk in terms of using the information, accessing the information in a different way. And the other risk, of course, that everybody has to consider is that what you're actually doing with moving to the cloud is potentially moving the way that you actually do business with your customers and clients. It can be an advantage in that you can actually collaborate more with your customers and clients. But if moving the information to a cloud slows down initially your capability of getting hold of a piece of information, then you have to understand that can have an impact on your customers. So make sure that you have a plan in place, you understand that you're following it through at a steady pace, and don't try and do the all in the basket at one go.
In your opinion, what are the challenges facing the growth of cloud computing in Ireland?
For me, the biggest challenge, well, there's two challenges, but the biggest challenge is really the robustness of the broadband connection. Coming from sort of outside of Ireland initially, where you have a very stable broadband rollout, there are certain areas in Ireland which still suffer from what I would call sort of the sort of shrinking down of the availability of broadband connections. And of course, the other thing that has an impact in terms of the rollout for people in a rural area is access to information. And in larger cities, you can turn around every corner and always find someone who will help you along the way. But as you move away from the large centres, getting accurate access to information, and I'll refer back to the Connemara councillor, the likelihood is that his information was being sort of sifted from lots of areas, but with no reference back to say, is this real, is this relevant, is it right?
Before we finish, I would like you to give me a real-life example of your experience with a business across County Wexford that might have had, let's say, between 5 and 10 computers in an office environment, and the effect that for them changing over to cloud computing that it would have had on their overall business.
Business of about 8 employees, probably many other sort of businesses, operated enormously on Excel spreadsheets and Word documents and PowerPoint presentations that they would send to customers. The downside is that they had as many versions and copies of those files as there were computers or people. In fact, beyond that, because people would store it on, memory sticks and take it somewhere else. So when it came to actually sending out the right piece of information, no one knew which was the real version. No one knew which was the right version. And in a particular area of sales where they would use their Excel spreadsheets to manage their sales forecasts, no one knew whether they were working on a current document, because salesman A would fill his in information and send it to a sales manager. Salesman B would do the same. Sales manager then has to sort of consolidate those two bits of information. Then salesman C sends his information in. He has to consolidate it again, but then he has to feed it out. By the time he's fed it out, it's changed. So the big advantage for them was by moving into what was basically a cloud-based Office application. So all of their Office documents, and there was Word and Excel and PowerPoint, they're all stored in one single repository. Now, the big advantage for that is that not only was it in a single repository, but when you touched it, you checked the document out. So everybody else could see a version that was real, but couldn't change it until that person checked it back in again. So you have one version of the document, always up to date. Everybody knew where it was, and also knew who was touching it because of that collaborative approach. Now, that in itself, just with the Excel spreadsheet, saved them an enormous amount of time. But the big advantage for them was they could store a current PowerPoint presentation in the cloud, and when someone was actually visiting a customer, if they had an issue, they didn't have to do anything else apart from use the customer's PC access. Let me log in and show you the latest presentation about our product and our services. That was a huge advantage for that business.
Well, Tony, I'm sure that's a scenario that lots of our listeners can relate to. Thank you for coming in this morning, and I wish you continued success with your own business.
You're listening to Southeast Radio's Business Matters with Karl Fitzpatrick in association with Wexford Insurances. Think Wexford Insurances for your business insurance.